and I hear from the left side this unearthly scream. I've never heard anything like it. Like, I can hear it coming at me, but I can't see it. And as soon as my left hand hit this thing, it took off. It blew my mind just to see it happen.
From HV Studio, this is Unnerved.
Welcome back to the Unnerved podcast. It's where normal people share their abnormal stories, and if you enjoy true stories of the strange and terrifying, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Chris Fricky. We've all heard the stories and the theories revolving around the legend of Sasquatch, or most famously known as Bigfoot. This fabled cryptid has become an icon within our culture and is commonly seen in gift shops or portrayed on TV in some way. But what if Bigfoot was doing more than lurking in our imaginations? What if Bigfoot actually exists? In today's story, Chuck describes a series of encounters he had while working as a wilderness guide at the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area in northern Minnesota. This vast remote landscape extends 150 miles along the US-Canadian border, covering over 1 million acres of lakes and forests. If you were to look at a map of this area, you'd quickly understand that this is the perfect place for a creature to hide. What Chuck experienced on this trip made him question whether he and his group were truly alone. This is his story.
I was working as an intern at a canoe base in northern Minnesota, and this was the summer of 2012, working as a guide up there. This was a base that was owned by the Boy Scouts of America. This is called the Charles L. Somers Base. It's in Ely, Minnesota, just outside of Ely. It's up what they call the Fernberg Highway. It's based on Moose Lake, and it is quite a large a canoe base. It's got a lot of cabins, and we have a great area that we can launch off water right from there. We have access to the highway. Really good location, and that is on the American side of the Boundary Waters canoe area. The Canadian side that we border is called the Quetico, so we run a lot of trips that kind of just bounce along the borders there. A typical trip for us is about 10 to 12 days, 7 at the bare minimum, 12 at the maximum. The most you can have in one group by permit out there is about 9 people. And so when you're running 9 people, that's a full crew. There are some rules out there. Even if you run across another crew, you are not even allowed to get within a certain amount of feet of them, or you violate your permit. So it's very interesting the way it works out there with the permits. But this particular crew that I was taking was a smaller crew, one of the younger ones I'd had. They were from Oklahoma. And we had myself, 2 adult advisors, basically the scoutmasters for that troop, and then we had the 6 boys. So 9 of us total. The boys were young. They were, I think the youngest was 10. He may have been 9, but I think the youngest was 10, and they went kind of up into about 13, 14. I've been working with crews that were about 16 to 18 up to that point. And a lot of the crews that come out, they either want to go fishing or they want to go do mileage. And so mileage, it's not that bad for a bigger crew of boys to do 200 miles. And that's what this crew wanted to do. And I knew from the beginning they might not pull it off, so I did have a backup plan in mind. And as it turned out, we were getting behind schedule, and there was no way we were going to make the 200. So I decided to detour us. And in that detour, because, you know, they were feeling a little beaten down, morale was low because they knew they weren't going to be able to get their mileage. But I told him we could definitely still get a 100-miler, and we could definitely still go and see some cool stuff because I knew a shortcut that would take us right through to where we needed to be. And that shortcut includes a waterfall. Waterfall is called Eddy Falls, and it is right off of Knife Lake, and there's a portage that runs right by it. And a portage is a trail that you carry all your stuff and your canoe and everything overland between two lakes. So the entire Boundary Waters and Quetico area it's just lakes and land. And so it's a lot of paddling, and then you get to a spot where you want to go to another lake and you got to pick everything up and carry it. It's never really that far unless you're doing some major portages, but it's never really that far. So we stopped and ate lunch at the falls, and then we put back in on the water, paddled around the corner there, and then we found a campsite very close to the waterfall. That way we could go hang out. There's not a lot of waterfalls there. It's pretty flat land. So we're up there, and we're hanging out at the campsite. The boys went down to the falls, and they took a shower, and we all went and got clean and came back. And I had a group of boys setting up camp, and I had the advisors working on a fire. And so I'm out in the woods and I'm gathering firewood. This area of Bramble, it's a lot of deadfall. A few years before we had been there had been a blowdown where they had what they call straight line winds, which is almost like a hurricane, but it's just a straight line, blows straight through, and it just knocks trees down. And so we were in an area that had been hit by this to some extent. And so, I mean, it's really just, you're very carefully trying to step over tops of, just down trees. And it's a lot of a deadfall that people have walked over. So you're walking on this very kind of sketchy trail to where you got to watch your feet because you'll punch through and you can break an ankle out there. So I'm out there gathering firewood. You got to remember there is this big bramble, so I can't see anything around me really, other than 10 yards in front of me on either direction, because I'm just covered in brush here. And I get to a point and I'm picking up some firewood, and I hear from the left side this unearthly scream. I've never heard anything like it. It stopped me dead. And I've been working in the woods. This is the first job I had working in the wilderness, but I've been in the woods since I was a kid. I've been a hunter since I was a child. I've been out alone in the woods since I was like 10 years old. And I've never heard anything like this in my life. And it just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. Froze me up a little bit. I didn't really know what it was. It was just curious at first. And I was like, that was extremely loud, and I've never heard that. And then the second one came. When the second one came, it was closer. It had a resonance that kind of bounced around inside your head, and it froze you up. And I've heard animals of all types scream, elk and mule deer and wildcats. There are animals out there that make noises that are horrifying to hear. The top end of it sounded almost like a cat, like a wildcat. But the lower end of it was like nothing I've ever heard before in my life. And by the third one, I could start to feel the noise. And starting to kind of reverberate within my body. And that was when it really kind of I don't want to say I blacked out, but I kind of lost track of what was happening for a minute. It was kind of one of those, it was almost like a trance a little bit. And I'm listening off to the left side, and it's coming straight at me. I can hear it coming at me, but I can't see it. And I can hear it crashing through the brush. And it's just getting closer and closer. And then I made this weird involuntary, like a whoop or a bark. That was a sound that I've never made before, and I've never made since. it was a weird primal kind of sound. Like I barked back at this thing, and it was not something I intended to do. Yeah, because it just hit me so deeply within like my being, not even my psyche. It was beyond my brain. It hit me in my body. It hit me somewhere way back on the timeline. That's the only way I can explain it. It hit me somewhere primal. And yeah, and I made a sound back to it, whatever it was, and then that kind of brought me back into reality. You got to remember, this is still going off. Like, this thing is still screaming. And I, at that point, dropped my woodpile and I ran back to camp because I remembered, I was like, I have people I'm responsible for at this point. And so I ran back to camp, and they had heard it too, of course. I mean, it was exceedingly loud. And the boys there at that point, you know, I mean, they were young. I could have told them basically anything and they would have believed it. But what I told them is that it was wild boar. And there are no wild boar in northern Minnesota. So they were from Oklahoma. So the scoutmasters, the advisors, they knew that was not boar. And one of them actually did say, he said, that wasn't a boar. What was that? And I had to tell him straight up. I said, I don't know what that was. I've never heard that before in my life. I said, but I think it's best we keep this kind of on the low from the boys because we're gonna have an issue on our hands if we don't. So from there, you know, we stayed in that campsite that night. We just kind of we brushed it off and went along with it and went to bed that night. And that's when the next part of the encounter really happened. I set my hammock, as a rule, when I worked at that job, you were able to set your hammock, you know, way off, far off as you wanted to, really, as long as you could hear camp. You were able to go have your space as a guide. And so I would set my hammock usually about, you know, 50 to 100 yards off from camp. So I was somewhere in that range. You know, as a rule, I always set my hammock right about at my head height so that when I'm laying in it, I'm about 6 feet off the ground. The only reason for that is that I kind of like being up high. I'm a climber. So so I was in my hammock there, and the way I would sleep if it was not raining would be just to take my tarp and throw it right over top of me like a blanket over your head. And the only reason for that is to keep, number one, the mosquitoes off, and number two, the morning dew. And so that's kind of my sleeping setup. I'm off from camp, up high in the tree in my hammock, and I've got a tarp over my head. And down toward my feet is all just thick brush. It's all that bramble I was out in earlier. And toward my head, that's where the water line is. And I wake up, had to be 3 or 4 in the morning based on how dark it was. And I hear this sound off in the woods toward my feet, and it sounded like a woman sobbing. And it wasn't a wailing. It was like a sobbing sound, like a, you know, like a sobbing sound. But it sounded like a woman. And so I wake up, and I'm like, what is that? And so I'm laying there under my tarp. I'm listening to the sound, and at the same time, I'm hearing it coming through the brush down toward my feet. But it's not coming directly toward me. It's going at a diagonal, kind of toward where camp is, over toward my left. And I'm listening to this sound and trying to place what animal it could be, like a moose or a bear or you know, any number of different things that you could find up there, and I can't place it because it sounds to me like human steps, like a bipedal individual, I guess. My initial reaction was that one of the scoutmasters was out and had gone to pee and got lost in the woods. You got to remember, half asleep, so I'm like trying to piece together the sobbing with the steps, and I'm like, what is happening right now? And the sobbing just kind of stops, and it's continuing to get closer to me, but at a diagonal to where it's going into camp. I'm listening to the footfalls and listening to it go basically just right through camp. It went past the tents and kept walking, and it is now heading right toward where I'm hanging in my hammock. So I'm still laying there under this tarp. I can't see anything, and I'm not sure if I want to move or not, because, I mean, at this point in my mind, it's either a bear or a moose. Either one you don't want to surprise. Because, yeah, I mean, a moose will stomp you to death in a heartbeat. And a black bear, if you surprise it bad enough, it will kill you. So it's, I'm like, I don't know what I want to do here. I'm just going to wait this out and listen. And I could feel its body presence on my left side as I'm hanging there, blind in this hammock. What happened next was essentially just what felt like an eternity, but it was only probably a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes tops, of me just listening to this thing breathe. It was something I've never heard really before. Like I've had bears next to my hammock all the time. I woke up with 3 bears next to my hammock, and you can smell a bear. This thing I could smell, but it didn't smell like a bear. And it also didn't sound like a bear. Like a bear has they snort like a dog does at sniffing something. But this thing had just a very measured in and out breath, but it was super congested. Both, every time you heard it, it was the in and out were both congested, and the smell of it wasn't musky, and it wasn't like a wet dog. It just had this weird quality of it that smelled like somewhere in between. It was almost like anybody who's ever spent a lot of time down south, that smelled like what a swamp smells like a low tide. It was kind of like a low tide mixed with a wet dog. It was a weird kind of smell, but it wasn't strong. It was very faint, but it was standing right there next to me. And like I said, it felt like forever, but it was only about 2 to 3 minutes before I made a decision. And I was like, well, this thing's just going to stand here until I make a move. And my move was to go ahead and get my hands slowly up under the tarp and go ahead and just push it off over my head. And when I did that, my left hand hit whatever this creature was. The only way I can describe what I felt was it felt like long, dreaded hair. It was not fur, it was hair. I touched it, I think, in the chest because of the musculature. I mean, it felt like a chest muscle. And as soon as my left hand hit this thing, it took off. I mean, it was gone down toward my feet. At that point, I actually thought that I had felt the shoulder of a moose. That was where I was at with it. But I was like, moose don't have hair that long, and they don't have matted hair. I was like, that was weird. I'm too tired to deal with it. I'm going to put it aside, and I'm just going to not mention this to the crew. So I did not mention it to any of my crew. Of course, the rest of that night, I didn't sleep, that's for sure. I did get up and look for prints. I found nothing because it's granite. But there was a definite trail of something that crashed through the bushes on both sides. We get up and go ahead and take off out of camp. And we only went not too far down to an island. It's called Robbins Island. It's on Knife Lake. And any of the U.S. side, the campsites are designated by a fire pit and a grumper. And the grumper is a giant fiberglass toilet seat that sits over a big hole. And they call it a grumper because anytime you go out there, the mosquitoes and the horseflies are so bad that it is a horrible experience. One of the adult advisors there, he decides to go up to the grumper, and we're still setting up camp. I mean, we're barely even set up. And so he goes up there, and it was not very long that he was up there, a couple minutes. He comes running back down. He's like pulling his pants up, like trying to get his belt done. He is cussing and swearing, talking about a gorilla. He said he saw a gorilla run across the path in front of him while he was sitting down. I asked him, was he sure it wasn't a bear? And he said it was not a bear, that he's been hunting bears his entire life in Oklahoma. And I have too. I've hunted bear a lot as well in North Carolina. And I know what he means when he says it wasn't a bear. You know a bear when you see one, and they don't run agile, upright across trails. And also, black bears are not 9 feet tall. And that was the estimate he put on that thing. He said it was about 9 feet tall, and it was definitely a monkey. So at that point, I started to think about my night in the hammock. And I'm like, well, if I was 6 feet up and I hit this thing in the chest, then that puts the head right around 8 or 9 feet. And, you know, at the time, I didn't know what we were dealing with. You got to remember, I'm not at this point thinking anything in particular. I'm just like, we're dealing with some kind of an animal out here, and I'm not sure what it is. I was like, all right, well, he's come down and he's freaked all these boys out, so we're definitely not going to sleep tonight. So I was like, let's change it up. We'll pack everything up. We'll do a night paddle. And just what it sounds like, that's paddling by headlamp. And you do it in the middle of the night. It's a lot of fun. For us, it seemed more like an escape tactic, but I was like, these boys aren't going to sleep, so let's just go ahead and get out of here. So we went ahead and left Robbins Island before we even had a night there. We started down our way back, and we did quite a few hours that night, including some like waist high water portages at night. But after a time, you come through some lakes, and you end up in what's called Newfound. That's what connects you back to Moose Lake, which is, of course, where our base camp is. I'm like, all right, well, we'll just, we'll go find a camp spot at the beginning of Moose Lake, and the next day we'll wake up and head in, because we were due to be in the next day anyhow. And so we're coming through from Newfound to Moose Lake, and instead of a portage there, you actually just have a very narrow little bit of water. It's like a little channel with two little spits of land that almost touch each other. And so it's a very narrow channel there. We're coming through, and the channel is not very deep, so you've got to hit it dead center. But from one bank to the other, at the very narrowest point, I would say at the time was probably 200 yards. But like I say, it's, you have to hit it right dead center. So we're anywhere from 75 to 100 yards into this thing. I mean, we're way into this pinch. And out of the side comes this big rock. I mean, it was like the size of a basketball or volleyball. A huge rock. And I mean, it was way up in the air, and it came and, almost hit the front of the canoe. It was dead in front of the front canoe, which is the one that I was steering, so I could get everybody through. And these are Kevlar canoes. If it would hit it, it would have crushed it. Yeah, it would have sunk that canoe 100%, like destroyed it. But it hit right in front of it, almost as if aimed. From there, I was like, paddle, go right now. There's nobody sitting out there in the woods with a trebuchet throwing rocks that size. No man can throw rocks that size. Bears don't throw rocks. Moose don't throw rocks. There's no cliffs. Other than falling from the sky, there's no way that would have been anything man-made. It blew my mind just to see it happen. So at that point, I didn't even know what to do. So I was like, let's just paddle to the middle of Moose Lake. So we paddled to the center of the lake, and we tied all three canoes together in a flotilla, and we dropped a couple anchors, and we slept on the lake that night. Well, I say slept, we just kind of sat awake all night on the lake. Interestingly enough, it was very silent that night. We didn't hear anything. The next morning, of course, was our time to come in. So we got up, went in, got our canoes unloaded, and got the crew unloaded and sent them, back to their cabin to get cleaned up for dinner and all that. We had dinner, and they did not want to talk about it, really. And, that's fine. I kind of did, but they didn't really want to, so it is what it is. I didn't really talk to them about it, and I sent them on their way the next day. And that following day, I was working on the base camp area, and I was working the canoe yard, just offloading crews that were coming in. And my buddy, who I had trained with there, he came in, and I was helping him offload canoes. He had a weird look on his face, like a 1,000-yard stare type deal going on, where it just like looked like there was something on his mind. And I asked him, I was like, "How was your trip, man?" He was like, "Well, it was great. We had a good week, and then we got into the Newfound area." And I was like, "Yeah, something happened there." He said, "Yeah, we came to the Newfound pinch. We had a rock thrown at us." And I was like because I had not told him what happened to us. So, like a pebble. He said, "No, it was like a rock. It was like like a big rock." And for a while after that, people kept coming off water from that area. It's called the Bear Loop. A lot of people will start talking about the Bear Loop and the Knife Lake area, Newfound and Moose, and having these experiences with, not only like rock throwing, but sounds, and there were several other sightings. So that happened for quite a while, and we were all kind of hanging out in the staff lodge one night. Eventually, these experiences came up in trail stories, and there was an old guide who was sitting in the back, and all he said at first was, he said, "Well, it's about time somebody else saw one." And he'd been there for over 10 years, and he had been seeing them for a long time. Apparently, he knew they were out there, especially in that particular area. And seems like a super down-to-earth guy, and I had no reason to doubt anything he ever said. But yeah, he definitely knew they were out there. After that point, I never really questioned what happened. But I think definitely it was a Bigfoot, or actually a population of them. I think they're a group, and I think that they hang out right in that Knife Lake area of the Boundary Waters. But yeah, it's definitely one of the experiences in my life it changed me a lot. I think about it all the time. What happened out there.
What was your viewpoint before this all happened? What was your view on Sasquatches, Bigfoot? Like, what was your view before starting out on that trip?
Well, before that, I was open to the idea. I grew up in the woods. I've always been out in the woods. I'm a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout. I've always been out in the woods, and I've had weird experiences. So I've never been closed off to the idea. I was always open to it. And once this happened to me, kind of solidified in my mind. I was like, all right, yeah, this might be a thing.
Did you go through there again or experience anything else strange like that in that location?
That actually ended up being my last tour there, my last guide trip there, because on that off shift, I got poison ivy so bad on my feet that I had to get steroid shots, and I couldn't go on my last trip. And I never ended up going back to that area again.
At some point in your life, you've probably come across the famous Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967. The footage shows a large gorilla-like creature walking away in the distance. To this day, experts still debate whether this film is a hoax or not. Fun little fact, this sighting was in Humboldt County, the same county where Young had his UFO encounter. If you want to listen to that episode, it's titled Chased by UFO. In North America, Bigfoot sightings continue to increase on a yearly basis. While many of these are clearly hoaxes or misidentifications, the amount of eyewitness accounts should give any rational person a reason to consider the possibility. Could Bigfoot be more than just folklore? Over the years, much of Bigfoot's existence has been used as a business plan for people to capitalize on, whether it's t-shirts, signs, TV shows, or video games. Though I'm not against this, I can't help but think that the Bigfoot industry continues to affect the credibility of first-hand accounts. Because of this, Bigfoot has grown to be more of a myth than a reality. I personally don't know what I believe at this point, but I can't excuse it as fiction. As I was finishing up my conversation with Chuck, he left me with this.
Right on, man. Well, hey, be a believer, man. They're out there. I promise you. They're out there.
Thanks again for listening to Unnerved. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to see photos related to each episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UNNERVEDPODCAST. There, you'll be able to see photos of Chuck during his time at the Boundary Waters. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.